Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward, and I'm delighted you've joined me. Tell me, is there lamplight where you sit? Perhaps the faint sound of rain beyond the window? These are the hours when Watson set down his accounts of reason and insight, when certainty gave way to careful thought. If you find comfort in these quiet investigations, do subscribe. Now settle in. For as Holmes understood, the most dangerous error is the conclusion which explains everything at once. You'll find Watson's Margins on Spotify as well. The link awaits you in the description below. Chapter 1. The Inheritance at Norwood Vale. The early months of the year 1895 were marked in my professional diary by an unusual succession of cases which called upon the peculiar talents of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Yet among the various problems which occupied his restless intellect during that period, few presented so singular a combination of apparent simplicity and ultimate complexity as the affair which I have come to know as the case of the Redacted will. The matter began upon a dreary February morning when the fog lay thick upon Baker Street, and the gas lamp still burned dimly against the grey dawn. I had descended to breakfast to find Holmes already seated at our table, his long fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee grown cold, his keen eyes fixed upon the columns of the Morning Times. He had not, I observed, touched the toast upon his plate, a sure sign that his mind was engaged upon some problem of interest. I had learned long ago not to disturb him during such moments of concentration, and so I applied myself to my own breakfast in companionable silence. It was perhaps 8:30 when the silence was broken by the sharp ring of our bell, followed shortly by the sound of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps upon the stair. She entered bearing a card upon her silver tray, her expression betraying that mixture of disapproval and resignation which she reserved for early morning callers who disturbed the household routine. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," she announced. "A Mr. Stephen Harbury. He apologises for the hour, but states that his business is most urgent." Holmes glanced at the card with that swift, penetrating look which could extract significance from the most commonplace of objects. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson," he said, setting aside his newspaper and rising to his feet. The morning promises to be less tedious than I had anticipated. "You know something of this gentleman, then?" I inquired as our landlady departed. "Nothing whatever, save what his card reveals. Observe, Watson. The pasteboard is of excellent quality, the printing crisp and recent, suggesting a man of professional standing who has not long established himself in business. The slight discoloration at the edge indicates the card has been carried in a leather case for some weeks. The name itself is unfamiliar to me, but the address places him in Lincoln's Inn Fields, which speaks of the legal profession." Before I could respond, the door opened once more to admit our visitor. Mr. Stephen Harbury proved to be a man of perhaps 35 years, of medium height and spare build, dressed in the sober black of the legal profession. His face was intelligent and regular of feature, though I noted at once the signs of considerable strain about his eyes and mouth. He carried a leather document case which he clutched rather tightly, and his manner, though outwardly composed, betrayed an underlying agitation. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble after the briefest of acknowledgments to myself, "I have come to you upon a matter of the gravest urgency. I am executor of the estate of the late Sir Lionel Markham, and I fear I am confronted with circumstances which suggest both fraud and, I hesitate to say it, murder." Holmes gestured to the basket chair beside the fire. "Pray be seated, Mr. Harbury, and tell us your story from the beginning. This is my friend and colleague Dr. Watson, in whose discretion you may have complete confidence. I observe that you have travelled from Norwood this morning, that you slept poorly last night, and that you have consulted at least 2 other gentlemen upon this matter before determining to seek my assistance." Our visitor started visibly. "Your reputation for observation does not exceed the truth, I see. But how could you possibly know these things?" "The mud upon your boots is of a reddish clay common to the Norwood district, and quite distinct from the London variety. The shadows beneath your eyes speak for themselves. As to your consultations, I note the corner of a letter protruding from your document case, bearing the seal of another firm of solicitors, while a second envelope visible in your coat pocket carries the crest of Scotland Yard. The natural progression would be to consult one's professional colleagues, as then the official police, and finally, when neither proves satisfactory, to seek private assistance. But these are trifles. Your story interests me far more than my deductions. Mr. Harbury settled himself in the chair and drew a long breath, as though marshalling his thoughts. The facts are these, gentlemen. Sir Lionel Markham, a retired civil engineer of considerable fortune, died 5 days ago at his country residence, Norwood Vale, under circumstances which at first appeared entirely natural. Sir Lionel was 68 years of age and had long suffered from a weak heart. His physician, Dr. Thornley, saw nothing suspicious in the death and was prepared to certify heart failure as the cause. But something altered this comfortable conclusion, Holmes prompted, his eyes bright with interest. Indeed. Upon examination of Sir Lionel's papers, I discovered his will in the private safe of his study. The document was in order and had been properly witnessed some 3 years previously. However, Mr. Holmes, the will had been altered. Several passages had been removed with extraordinary care and replaced with strips of paper bearing abbreviated clauses in what appeared to be Sir Lionel's own hand. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Describe these alterations with precision, if you please. The redactions were executed with remarkable skill. Thin strips had been cut from the original document with a sharp blade, and new slips of paper, matching perfectly in width and length, had been inserted and sealed into place with wax. The new clauses were written in a hand very similar to Sir Lionel's own, though I cannot swear to their authenticity. The substance of these alterations is most significant. The original will, of which I possess a copy from Sir Lionel's solicitors, left the bulk of the estate to various charitable institutions, with a comfortable but modest provision for Sir Lionel's nephew, Mr. Edward Markham. The altered version leaves nearly the entire fortune to this same Edward Markham. A substantial change indeed, I observed. And you suspect this Edward Markham of forgery? Mr. Harbury's face grew troubled. I wish I could say otherwise, Dr. Watson, but the circumstances point most damningly in that direction. Edward Markham was present at Norwood Vale on the evening before his uncle's death. He admits to having quarrelled with Sir Lionel about money. He possessed knowledge of the safe's combination, having observed his uncle open it upon previous visits. Moreover, when questioned by Inspector Lestrade, who now has charge of the matter, young Markham displayed a nervous and evasive manner most unbefitting an innocent man. Holmes rose and began to pace before the fire, his hands clasped behind his back. You have brought the will with you, I trust. I have, though Inspector Lestrade insisted upon retaining the original. This is a precise copy, made under my supervision. He drew from his document case a folded sheet of legal foolscap and handed it to Holmes, who carried it to the window where the light, such as it was, fell most strongly. For several minutes my friend examined the document in silence, employing his lens upon certain portions with particular care. I observed the characteristic intensity of his concentration, the slight movements of his lips as he noted details invisible to the ordinary observer. At length he returned to the table and laid the paper before him. Most interesting, he murmured, most suggestive. Tell me, Mr. Harbury, what is Inspector Lestrade's view of the matter? Our visitor's expression darkened. The inspector considers the case all but proven. He believes that Edward Markham forged these alterations, murdered his uncle to prevent discovery of the fraud, and now seeks to inherit through his crime. I confess, Mr. Holmes, that the evidence appears overwhelming, yet I cannot rid myself of certain doubts. It is these doubts which have brought me to you. Your instincts do you credit, said Holmes. What is your impression of Edward Markham? You have met him, I presume? Several times. He is a young man of perhaps 28, educated at Cambridge but with no settled profession. He has, I fear, lived somewhat beyond his means, and is known to have incurred certain debts. His manner toward me has been civil enough, though marked by considerable agitation since his uncle's death. He protests his innocence most vehemently, yet he cannot satisfactorily explain several damaging facts. Holmes resumed his pacing. You mentioned that the redactions appeared methodical. Describe them more fully. They were, as I said, executed with extraordinary precision. Each strip was cut with mathematical exactness, the replacement slips fitted with perfect accuracy. There was nothing hasty or desperate about the work. It suggested, if I may say so, a considerable deliberation and preparation. Precisely, said Holmes with sudden energy. That is the detail which interests me most profoundly. When a man commits forgery under the pressure of immediate need, his work bears the marks of haste and anxiety. Yet you describe alterations which required time, skill, and careful planning. The contradiction is suggestive, Mr. Harbury. Most suggestive indeed. Then you will take the case? Our visitor asked, hope evident in his voice. I will examine the matter, Holmes replied, though I must warn you that my conclusions may not prove to be what you wish to hear. The truth is not always comfortable, but it is always preferable to comfortable error. Can you arrange for us to visit Norwood Vale? With the greatest ease. The house remains largely as Sir Lionel left it, or under police supervision. Inspector Lestrade has completed his initial examination, but would, I am certain, welcome your assistance. A faint smile crossed Holmes's lips. Lestrade's enthusiasm for my assistance varies with the difficulty of his case. In this instance, where he believes the solution obvious, he may prove less receptive. Nevertheless, we shall call upon him. Watson, you will accompany me? Certainly, I replied, for I had no pressing engagements, and the case promised to be of interest. Excellent. Mr. Harbury, we shall meet you at Norwood Vale at 2 o'clock this afternoon. That will give me time to consult certain records which may prove relevant. In the meanwhile, I would advise you to maintain absolute discretion regarding this consultation. If there is indeed fraud and murder in this affair, the criminal will be watching for any signs of investigation beyond the official channels. Our visitor departed with expressions of profound gratitude, and I turned to find Holmes standing before the fire, his expression thoughtful. Well, Watson, he said, what do you make of our client? He seems an honest man, troubled by doubts about a case which appears straightforward. Straightforward, yes, perhaps too straightforward. When a crime presents itself with all its evidence arranged for inspection, like goods in a shop window, I'm inclined to wonder who has arranged the display and for what purpose. But we shall see. The morning is yet young, and I have some researches to conduct. Be so good as to consult Bradshaw. We shall need to know the trains to Norwood. With that he retreated to his chemical corner, where he spent the next 2 hours in operations which involved test tubes, reagents, and a most unpleasant smell, while I occupied myself with my own affairs and contemplated the peculiar problem which had been laid before us. Little did I suspect, as I sat in our comfortable rooms that foggy February morning, how deeply the case of the redacted will would challenge every assumption we had formed, nor how cunningly the truth had been obscured beneath a surface of apparent certainty. Chapter 2. Evidence Beyond Dispute. The afternoon train to Norwood carried us through suburbs still wrapped in the grey embrace of winter fog. Holmes sat silent throughout the journey, his eyes half closed, his fingers steepled before his lips in that attitude which I had learned to associate with intense mental activity. He had spoken scarcely a word since our departure from Baker Street, and I knew better than to interrupt his meditations with idle conversation. Norwood Vale proved to be a substantial residence of red brick, set back from the road among bare elms and laurels. The house bore that air of solid respectability which characterised the homes of successful professional men in the outer London districts. A constable stood at the gate, and I observed that the front windows of the upper story were shuttered, as was customary in a house of mourning. We were met at the door by Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, whose sharp-featured face wore an expression of satisfaction which I had seen upon it before when he believed himself in possession of an open and shut case, and he greeted Holmes with that mixture of respect and condescension which marked their professional relationship. "Good afternoon, Mr. Holmes," he said. "Mr. Harbury mentioned you might be calling. I confess I'm not sure what more there is to discover. The case appears quite straightforward to my mind." "Then you have formed a definite theory?" Holmes inquired as we followed Lestrade into the entrance hall. "More than a theory, Mr. Holmes. I should say the matter is all but proven. Young Edward Markham forged the will and poisoned his uncle to prevent discovery. The evidence is overwhelming." "I should be most interested to examine this overwhelming evidence," said Holmes mildly. "Shall we begin with the scene of the death?" Lestrade led us to a handsomely appointed study on the ground floor. The room was lined with bookcases, and a large mahogany desk stood before the window. In the corner, partially concealed by a velvet curtain, I observed a substantial iron safe, its door standing open. "Sir Lionel was found here," Lestrade explained, gesturing to a leather armchair near the fireplace. "He had been dead some hours when the butler discovered him at 7 o'clock on the morning of the 3rd. Dr. Thornley, the local physician, initially attributed the death to heart failure. Sir Lionel had a weak heart and had suffered minor attacks previously." "What altered Dr. Thornley's opinion?" I asked. "The discovery of the altered will prompted a more thorough examination. Upon analysis, traces of arsenic were found in the port wine remaining in Sir Lionel's glass. The decanter on that table also contained the poison." Holmes crossed to the small side table indicated by Lestrade. Upon it stood a crystal decanter, half full of port, and beside it a single glass bearing the residue of wine. He examined both without touching them, then turned his attention to the safe. "The will was discovered in the safe, I understand?" "Precisely. Mr. Harbury, as executor, knew the location of Sir Lionel's important papers. He opened the safe the morning after the death and found the will within. The alterations were immediately apparent. And the safe shows no signs of having been forced. None whatever. It was opened with the proper combination." Holmes knelt before the safe and examined it closely with his lens. I watched as his keen eyes travelled over every inch of the metal surface, the door, the hinges, the lock mechanism itself. He spent several minutes in this examination before rising to his feet. "Who possessed knowledge of the combination?" he asked. "Sir Lionel himself, naturally. Mr. Harbury, as executor, had been given the combination in a sealed letter held by Sir Lionel's solicitors, and Edward Markham admits to having observed his uncle open the safe on more than one occasion during his visits here." "Admits to it?" Holmes's eyebrows rose slightly. "That seems remarkably candid for a guilty man." Lestrade smiled thinly. "The young fool thought himself clever, you see. He claimed he needed to mention it to explain why his fingerprints might be found on the safe, but that very admission condemned him. His prints are indeed present, quite fresh ones, on the door and dial." "I see. And what other evidence have you gathered?" The inspector drew a notebook from his pocket with evident satisfaction. "A considerable amount, Mr. Holmes. We found this in the grate of Edward Markham's bedroom." He produced a charred fragment of paper, carefully preserved between 2 sheets of glass. Even in its damaged state, I could make out portions of legal language and what appeared to be draft clauses of a will. "Most suggestive," Holmes murmured, examining the fragment. "What else?" "A penknife belonging to Markham was found in his room. Analysis shows traces of sealing wax upon the blade, of the same composition as the wax used to seal the altered sections of the will. Furthermore, the housemaid, a girl named Annie Price, reports that she heard raised voices between uncle and nephew on the evening before the death. She could not make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably angry. The maid is certain it was Edward Markham's voice. Absolutely certain. She has been in service here for 2 years and knows all the family voices well." Holmes walked slowly about the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Tell me, Inspector, what does Edward Markham say in his own defence?" "Very little that helps him. He admits to visiting his uncle that evening. He admits they quarrelled about money. He claims the argument concerned a personal loan, not the inheritance, and that they parted on civil terms. He swears he had no knowledge of any alterations to the will and certainly did not make them himself. But here is the most damning evidence of all." Lestrade leaned forward, his voice dropping to a tone of triumph. When questioned about the provisions of the original will, Markham described them incorrectly. He stated that his uncle had intended to leave him merely £1,000, when in fact the original bequest was for £5,000. How could he make such an error unless he had altered the document himself and forgotten the precise original terms? I confess this last point struck me as highly significant, and I looked to Holmes to see how he received it. My friend's expression, however, remained inscrutable. "Where is Edward Markham at present?" he asked. "At the Swan Inn in the village, under police observation. I have not yet arrested him formally, but it is merely a matter of time. The evidence must be presented to the magistrate, of course, but I anticipate no difficulty in obtaining a warrant. I should like to speak with him. Certainly, though I doubt you will find him more forthcoming than he has been with me. He maintains his innocence with considerable vehemence, but then, what else would you expect?" "Indeed. Before we visit Mr. Markham, however, might I examine the will itself?" Lestrade produced a legal document from his case and handed it to Holmes. My friend carried it to the window and subjected it to a prolonged and minute examination. I watched as he studied the paper from various angles, held it up to the light, and applied his lens to the areas where the alterations had been made. The silence stretched for perhaps 10 minutes, while Lestrade and I waited with what patience we could muster. "Remarkable," Holmes said at length. "The work is extraordinarily precise. The cuts are mathematically straight, the replacement slips fitted with the accuracy of a craftsman. Whoever executed these alterations possessed both skill and time." "Markham was a scholar at Cambridge," Lestrade observed. "He would have had access to the necessary tools and the education to use them properly." "Quite so. Yet there is something here which troubles me, Inspector. When a man commits forgery in haste, under the pressure of need or fear, his hand betrays him. There are irregularities, hesitations, corrections. I see none of that here. The writing flows without pause, the measurements are exact to the fraction of an inch. This suggests deliberation, planning, almost a leisurely execution, which merely proves that Markham planned the crime carefully. The debts which drove him to it did not arise overnight." Holmes folded the document and returned it. "Perhaps. Tell me, has anything else of significance been discovered?" "One further matter. The gardener reports seeing Edward Markham walking in the grounds at dusk on the evening in question, some hours before the quarrel reported by the housemaid. Markham claims he arrived only at 7 o'clock, yet here is evidence he was present much earlier. The man is caught in a web of his own lies, Mr. Holmes." "We shall see. I think I should now like to speak with the household staff if they are available." For the next hour, Holmes questioned the servants with that thorough attention to detail which characterised his methods. The butler, a dignified man of advanced years, could add little to what we already knew, and Sir Lionel had retired to his study after dinner, as was his habit. He had seemed in normal spirits, perhaps a trifle preoccupied, but nothing more. The housemaid, Annie Price, confirmed her account of the quarrel. The cook had seen nothing unusual. The gardener, an elderly man named Hodges, repeated his observation of Edward Markham in the grounds. Throughout these interviews I observed that Holmes's questions often seemed to stray from the central matter of the death and the will. He inquired about Sir Lionel's habits, his daily routine, his recent correspondence, matters which appeared tangential to the crime. Yet I had learned long ago that Holmes's apparent digressions often proved essential to his eventual solution. As we prepared to depart for the Swan Inn, I drew Holmes aside. "The evidence does seem rather conclusive," I ventured. "Edward Markham had motive, means, and opportunity. The physical evidence ties him to both the forgery and the murder." Holmes paused at the threshold and glanced back at the study. His expression was troubled, almost dissatisfied. "When a case appears complete before it has begun, Watson," he said quietly, "we must inquire what has been omitted. Evidence which points too directly may point falsely. But come, let us hear what the accused has to say for himself." The afternoon was drawing toward dusk as we made our way through the village to the Swan Inn. A cold wind had risen, dispersing some of the fog, and the first stars were visible in the darkening sky, I found myself reflecting upon the apparent strength of the case against Edward Markham. Yet I could not ignore the note of reservation in Holmes's voice. My friend was troubled by something in the evidence, some detail which did not satisfy his rigorous logic, though he had not yet shared his concerns with me. We found Edward Markham in a private sitting room, attended by a constable who withdrew at Lestrade's nod. The young man who rose to greet us was tall and fair, with the bearing of an athlete but the drawn features of one under severe mental strain. His eyes, I noted, were red-rimmed. Whether from grief or sleeplessness or both I could not say. "Mr. Holmes," he said, and there was desperate hope in his voice. "They tell me you're investigating my uncle's death. Thank God someone will listen to reason. I swear to you, upon my honour, I did not harm him. I loved him. He was more than an uncle to me. He was a second father after my own parents died." Holmes regarded him thoughtfully. "Sit down, Mr. Markham. I've come neither to accuse nor to absolve, but to seek truth. Tell me, in your own words, what occurred on the evening of the 3rd. What followed was a recital which, I confess, did little to exculpate the speaker, yet was delivered with such evident sincerity that I found myself half inclined to believe it despite the evidence arrayed against him. As we left the inn an hour later, Holmes remained silent, lost in thought. The case of the redacted will had begun, and already I sensed that it would prove far more complex than the obvious solution suggested by the evidence. Chapter 3. The Accepted Theory. We returned to Baker Street as darkness fell over London, and I observed that Holmes maintained his thoughtful silence throughout the journey. He sat in the corner of our compartment, his chin sunk upon his breast, his eyes fixed unseeing upon the passing landscape. I had witnessed this mood before, and knew it signalled deep engagement with some problem whose solution had not yet revealed itself to his satisfaction. Upon our arrival at our lodgings, Holmes went directly to his chair by the fire and remained there, motionless save for the occasional raising of his hand to his lips as he drew upon his pipe. I busied myself with my notes of the case, attempting to arrange the facts in some coherent order, yet I found my attention repeatedly drawn to my friend's immobile figure. It was past 9 o'clock when he finally stirred, reaching for the copy of the will which he had obtained from Lestrade. He spread it upon the table and subjected it once more to the most minute scrutiny, employing both his lens and a small graduated rule which he kept for such purposes. "Watson," he said at length, without looking up from his examination, "what strikes you as most significant about this document?" I rose and joined him at the table. The alterations themselves, surely. The fact that they so greatly benefit Edward Markham. Yes, the alterations benefit him considerably. But I ask you to observe not the substance but the execution. Look here, at this first redacted section. He indicated a passage where perhaps 2 inches of the original text had been removed and replaced with a slip bearing new wording. What do you observe? I examined the section carefully. The replacement appears to fit perfectly. The edges are clean and straight. Precisely. Now measure the width of the slip. I applied the rule as Holmes had done. 7/8 of an inch, as near as I can determine. Exactly 7/8. Not approximately, but exactly. Now examine this second alteration, some 4 inches below, I measured as directed. Also 7/8 of an inch. And the third, the same. Now observe the ink. What do you notice about its colour and consistency? I studied the new text with care. It appears identical to the ink used in the original document. Not merely similar, Watson, but identical. The same shade, the same flow, even the same degree of fading where the pen has been lifted and reapplied. Consider what this implies. The forger would need not only to possess ink of precisely the same type as that used 3 years ago when the will was drafted, but also to allow for the natural aging of that ink upon paper. Perhaps he obtained ink from Sir Lionel's own supply. A possibility, certainly. But now consider the handwriting itself. Holmes produced a magnifying glass and held it over the altered passages. The script flows without hesitation. There are no tremors, no signs of careful copying or imitation. If this is forgery, it is forgery of the most accomplished kind. Edward Markham was educated at Cambridge, I observed, echoing Lestrade's earlier comment. Such institutions produce men of considerable skill in penmanship. True enough. Yet skill in penmanship and skill in forgery are not the same thing. To produce writing which so perfectly mimics another hand requires not merely practice, but a certain criminal expertise. Does Edward Markham's history suggest such expertise? I had to confess it did not. What, then, is your theory? Holmes laid aside his lens and relit his pipe, which had gone out during his examination. I have no theory as yet, only observations which trouble me. Consider the facts as Lestrade presents them. Edward Markham was in financial difficulties. He knew the combination to his uncle's safe. He quarrelled with his uncle about money. His fingerprints are upon the safe. His penknife bears traces of sealing wax. Fragments of what appear to be draft clauses were found in his room, and he incorrectly described the original will's provisions. The evidence forms a perfect chain, each link supporting the next. And this perfection troubles you? It does, Watson. When nature arranges evidence, there are always irregularities, inconsistencies, puzzling details which require explanation. When man arranges evidence, he strives for logical coherence. The question is whether we are observing nature's chaos or man's design. But surely the physical evidence cannot lie. The fingerprints, the penknife, the burned fragments. Physical evidence can be as susceptible to manipulation as testimony, my dear fellow. A fingerprint merely proves that a hand touched an object, not when or for what purpose. Sealing wax on a blade proves only that the blade contacted wax at some point. Burned paper in a grate proves only that paper was burned. Each fact is indisputable in isolation, yet the narrative which connects them may be entirely false. I confess I found this reasoning difficult to follow. Yet what alternative explanation can there be? If Edward Markham did not alter the will and murder his uncle, who did? That is precisely the question which occupies me. Let us examine what we know of Edward Markham himself, setting aside for a moment the evidence against him. He is young, careless with money, accustomed to relying upon his uncle's generosity. He freely admits to being present on the evening of the death, to quarrelling about money, to knowing the safe's combination. These are not the admissions of a calculating murderer seeking to conceal his crime. Perhaps he believes that partial candour will appear more honest than complete denial. Again, possible. Yet consider his error regarding the original will. Lestrade presents this as proof of guilt, arguing that a forger might forget the precise terms he had altered. But could not the reverse be true? An innocent man, never having read the original will, might easily misremember its provisions, particularly if those provisions had been the subject of family speculation and hearsay. This observation struck me with considerable force. You suggest he simply assumed his inheritance would be smaller than it actually was. I suggest we should not assume that an error of memory constitutes proof of forgery. Memory is a treacherous witness, Watson, particularly when coloured by expectation and anxiety. He rose and began to pace, a sure sign that his thoughts were crystallizing. No, there is something fundamentally unsatisfying about this case. The evidence is too convenient, the conclusion too obvious. What will you do? I shall continue to examine the matter from every angle. Tomorrow I wish to return to Norwood Vale and conduct a more thorough investigation of Sir Lionel's study. There are several small details which require clarification. What sort of details? Holmes smiled faintly. That I shall not say until I have confirmed certain suspicions. It is a capital mistake to theorize in advance of one's data. At present, I merely observe that the facts agree too readily with expectation. The following morning brought a development which seemed to strengthen the case against Edward Markham considerably. Holmes was examining the agony columns of the morning papers, a regular habit of his, when he suddenly sat forward with an exclamation. "What is it?" I asked. A notice in the Times placed 3 weeks ago. He read aloud. Would the gentleman who inquired about legal stationery at Messrs. Whiteley and Sons, stationers, Norwood High Street, on the 14th of January, please return? An item left behind requires collection. I failed to see the significance. The 14th of January was precisely 3 weeks before Sir Lionel's death. Lestrade should be informed immediately. Within 2 hours we learned that the gentleman in question had indeed been Edward Markham, who had purchased a quantity of fine-laid paper closely matching the stock used for Sir Lionel's will. This intelligence sent Lestrade into transports of satisfaction. "There is your proof, Mr. Holmes," he declared when we met him at Scotland Yard that afternoon. "The man purchased materials for his forgery weeks in advance. This was no sudden crime of passion, but a calculated murder for gain." Yet even this discovery did not dispel the shadow of doubt from Holmes's features. We returned once more to Norwood Vale, where he spent the better part of the afternoon in Sir Lionel's study. I watched as he examined every inch of the room with meticulous care, measuring, calculating, comparing. He paid particular attention to the desk drawers, the safe itself, and, curiously, to the window curtains and the carpet beneath them. "Holmes," I said at length, for his behaviour was becoming increasingly enigmatic, "what exactly are you seeking?" "Evidence of absence, Watson, which is often as significant as evidence of presence. Tell me, when you observe this room, what impression does it give you?" I glanced about the study. "It appears to be the workspace of an organised, methodical man. The books are arranged with care, the desk is orderly, the papers neatly filed." "Exactly so. Sir Lionel was a civil engineer, a profession which demands precision and order. Now consider what we have been told about the alterations to his will. Would such a man, discovering a need to modify his testamentary dispositions, approach the task with the same precision he applied to his professional work?" "I should think so. Yes." "Then we must ask ourselves a question which has been overlooked in the rush to judgment. If Sir Lionel himself wished to alter his will, how would he proceed? Would he not measure carefully, cut precisely, write without hesitation? Would not his work bear all the hallmarks we observe in these alterations?" The suggestion was so startling that for a moment I could not credit it. "You believe Sir Lionel altered his own will?" "I am not yet prepared to state what I believe. I merely observe that we have assumed alteration implies deception, yet the author of a document may alter it honestly. The question is not whether the will was altered, but by whom, when, and for what purpose." As we departed Norwood Vale that evening, I found my thoughts in considerable turmoil. The case which had appeared so straightforward now seemed clouded with uncertainty. Yet I could not deny that Holmes's observations possessed a certain logic. The precision of the alterations, the perfect match of materials, the unhesitating script, all these might indeed suggest the work of the testator himself rather than a forger. "What is your next step?" I inquired as our train carried us back toward London. "I must determine precisely when those alterations were made," Holmes replied. "If I can establish that they predate Edward Markham's final visit to Norwood Vale, then the entire structure of the prosecution's case collapses. But that will require more evidence than I currently possess. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall make further inquiries. For tonight, I must review everything we have learned and consider what we may have missed." He lapsed into silence once more, and I did not disturb his meditations. The case of the redacted will was proving more complex with each passing hour, and I sensed that we had only begun to penetrate its mysteries. Chapter 4. A Curious Detail. The next morning found Holmes in that state of restless energy, which invariably accompanied the pursuit of some elusive fragment of evidence. He had been awake since before dawn, as I discovered upon descending to breakfast, and had already dispatched 3 telegrams and consulted no fewer than 4 reference works from his shelves. "Ah, Watson," he greeted me, scarcely looking up from the volume before him. "I trust you slept well. I require your assistance this morning. We must return to Norwood Vale, but first I wish to make a call upon Messrs. Carruthers and Webb, manufacturers of fine inks and writing materials." "To what purpose?" To determine the age of ink upon paper, my dear fellow. It is a subject which has occupied several continental chemists in recent years, though their methods remain imperfect. Nevertheless, I believe we may obtain useful information. The visit to the ink manufacturers proved enlightening, though the details of Holmes's consultation were largely technical in nature. I gathered that he had brought with him samples of the ink from both the original will and the altered passages, obtained through methods he did not explain, and that the chemists were able to offer certain observations regarding their composition and probable age. We arrived at Norwood Vale shortly before noon. Lestrade was not present, having been called to attend to other duties, and we were admitted by the butler, who showed us once more to Sir Lionel's study. Holmes immediately began a systematic examination which left no corner of the room unexplored. I watched as he scrutinised the safe with particular attention. He examined the key, which hung from a small hook inside the top drawer of the desk, holding it up to the light and studying its surface through his lens. "Observe, Watson," he said, beckoning me closer. "The key shows no recent scratches or marks of any kind. The brass is worn smooth from years of use, but there are no fresh abrasions such as might be caused by nervous or hasty handling. Perhaps the safe was opened with care. Perhaps. Yet consider the circumstances we are asked to accept. Edward Markham, in the grip of desperate financial need, enters his uncle's study, opens the safe, removes the will, and proceeds to alter it with forged additions. Yet would not his hands tremble? Would not the key slip, scratch, betray some sign of agitation? He replaced the key and turned his attention to the safe itself. Kneeling before it, he examined the interior with minute care, noting the arrangement of the remaining documents and even, to my puzzlement, collecting samples of dust from its corners upon a slip of paper, which he folded and placed in his pocket-book. "The dust accumulation is most instructive," he remarked. "It indicates that this safe has been opened frequently and regularly. See here, along the bottom edge, where the dust is minimal. This suggests the door has been opened and closed many times in recent weeks, preventing the normal accumulation one would expect in a household where servants are not permitted to clean the interior of a safe." Rising to his feet, he moved to the desk and began opening drawers with systematic thoroughness. In the third drawer he paused, his attention arrested by something within. He drew out a small wooden ruler, perhaps 6 inches in length, and a slender cutting blade of the type used by draftsmen. "Most interesting," he murmured, examining both implements with care. "What do you make of these, Watson?" I studied the items he held. A ruler and a blade such as any careful man might keep for correspondence or document work. Quite so. But observe their condition. The ruler bears faint pencil marks at regular intervals, 7/8 of an inch to be precise. The blade is freshly sharpened and shows signs of very recent use. There are minute fibres of paper adhering to its edge, suggesting that someone used these tools to cut paper, suggesting it very strongly indeed. Now we know from the housekeeper that Sir Lionel was a man of meticulous habits. Edward Markham, by all accounts, is careless and untidy. His rooms at Cambridge were notoriously disordered, according to the information I obtained yesterday. Yet these tools are arranged with geometrical precision in their drawer. The ruler is aligned parallel to the drawer's edge. The blade lies at a perfect right angle to it. This is not the work of a careless man. He returned the items to their drawer and stood for a moment in thought. Then, turning to the window, he drew aside the heavy velvet curtains and examined both the fabric and the window-sill with his lens. "What now?" I asked, and somewhat bewildered by this succession of minute observations. "I am seeking to understand Sir Lionel's habits in his final days. Tell me, what do you observe about this window?" I looked at it carefully. It faces south, providing good light for reading or writing. Excellent. And the dust upon the sill? There is very little, suggesting the window is cleaned regularly. Yet here, in this corner, observe a small accumulation which the maid's cloth has missed. It contains fragments of paper, Watson. Very fine fragments, as though someone had trimmed paper near this window and the cuttings had fallen onto the sill. He collected these fragments as carefully as he had gathered the dust from the safe, then turned his attention to the carpet. For several minutes he crawled about the floor, examining it inch by inch with his lens, occasionally picking up some minute particle which he deposited in separate envelopes. The butler entered at this moment with a message, and I observed his expression of poorly concealed astonishment at finding the famous detective upon his hands and knees. Holmes, however, appeared entirely oblivious to the incongruity of his position. "Excuse me, sir," the butler said, addressing himself to me in the absence of a more dignified alternative, "but Mrs. Berridge, the housekeeper, wishes to know if the gentleman will be requiring luncheon." "That is very kind," I replied, "but I think we shall not impose upon the household. Holmes, shall we—" "One moment, Watson. My good man," Holmes said, rising to his feet and addressing the butler directly. "I should very much like to speak with Mrs. Berridge. Would you be so kind as to ask her to attend me here?" The housekeeper proved to be a stout, capable woman of middle age, with the forthright manner of one long accustomed to managing a gentleman's household. She answered Holmes's questions with admirable precision. "You have been in Sir Lionel's service for how many years, Mrs. Berridge?" 12 years this past Michaelmas, sir." "And you would characterize him as a man of regular habits?" "Most regular, sir. You could set your watch by Sir Lionel's routine. Breakfast at 8, luncheon at 1, dinner at 7. He worked in his study every morning from 9 until noon, and again in the evening after dinner until he retired at 10. "Did he often work late into the night?" Mrs. Berridge hesitated. "Not as a general rule, sir, but in recent weeks. I several times observed a light in his study window when I rose early. He appeared to be working on some matter which occupied him considerably." "Did he mention the nature of this work?" "Not directly, sir, but he did remark to me, perhaps a week before his death, that he intended to set matters right. Those were his exact words. 'I mean to set matters right, Mrs. Berridge, and put old wrongs to rest.'" Holmes's eyes gleamed with interest. "Did you form any impression of what he meant by this?" "I assumed, sir, that it concerned the family. Sir Lionel had no children of his own, and I believe he felt some responsibility for the welfare of his relations. He had spoken before of wishing to ensure they were properly provided for." "Thank you, Mrs. Berridge. You have been most helpful. One final question. Did Sir Lionel ever permit anyone else to open his safe?" "Never, sir. He was most particular about it. He kept all his important papers there, and no one but himself had access to it. Even Mr. Harbury, the executor, did not possess the combination until after Sir Lionel's death, when it was provided to him by the solicitors." After Mrs. Berridge had departed, Holmes stood silent for several minutes, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then, abruptly, he moved to the desk and began examining Sir Lionel's personal papers, which Lestrade had left in good order after his initial investigation. Among these papers, Holmes discovered a small leather-bound notebook, which he opened and studied with increasing attention. I observed his expression change as he turned the pages, a look of something approaching satisfaction crossing his features. "Watson," he said quietly, "I believe I've found what I was seeking. Look here." He showed me a page of the notebook covered with measurements and calculations in Sir Lionel's neat hand. Among the figures I could make out repeated references to 7/8 inch and notes regarding paper stock and ink types. "What does it mean?" I asked. "It means, my dear Watson, that we have assumed alteration implies deception, yet the author of a document may alter it honestly. These are Sir Lionel's own notes for modifying his will. The measurements correspond exactly to the width of the strips which were cut from the original document. The dates in the margin indicate he was working on this matter for several weeks before his death. Then Sir Lionel himself made the alterations? So it would appear. But if that is the case, Watson, then every assumption upon which the case against Edward Markham rests must be questioned. We have been pursuing the wrong man, and the real criminal has been directing our attention precisely where he wished it to fall." I felt a chill at these words. "Then who?" "That I cannot yet say with certainty, but I begin to perceive the outlines of a scheme far more cunning than a simple forgery. Come, we must return to London. I have several telegrams to send and certain inquiries to make. This case is not at all what it appears to be, and before we can unmask the true criminal, we must understand precisely what Sir Lionel intended by his alterations and who stood to lose by them. As we made our way back to the station, my mind whirled with the implications of Holmes's discoveries. If Sir Lionel had indeed altered his own will, then Edward Markham's supposed motive disappeared entirely. Yet the evidence against him remained damning in its accumulation. How could both things be true? And if Edward was innocent, who had committed this terrible crime, and to what end? I put these questions to Holmes, but he merely shook his head. Patience, Watson. We have established one crucial fact, but many questions remain. Why did Sir Lionel alter his will? What were the actual changes he made? And most importantly, who knew of these changes and stood to suffer by them? When we can answer these questions, we shall have our criminal. Until then, we must gather our evidence and trust to logic to guide us to the truth. The afternoon train carried us back to London through a countryside wrapped in winter mist, and I reflected that the fog which obscured the landscape was no thicker than the confusion which still shrouded this most perplexing case. Chapter 5. Words and Expectations. The discovery of Sir Lionel's notebook had, I believed, settled the central question of the case. Yet Holmes's manner upon our return to Baker Street suggested that he found the matter anything but resolved. He spent the evening in deep consultation with various reference works, and in composing telegrams to correspondents whose identity he did not reveal to me. It was past midnight when he finally set aside his papers and turned to where I sat reading by the fire. "Watson," he said abruptly, "tell me what you recall of Mrs. Berridge's exact words regarding Sir Lionel's intentions." I closed my book and considered. She said that he intended to set matters right and to put old wrongs to rest. Precisely. And the gardener, Hodges, what did he report? I consulted the notes I'd taken during our investigations. He mentioned that Sir Lionel had spoken of correcting an injustice, and Edward Markham himself when we interviewed him at the Swan Inn. What were his words? He claimed his uncle had promised to make things fair again. Holmes rose and began his characteristic pacing. 3 witnesses, Watson, each employing different language, yet each conveying the same essential meaning. Sir Lionel intended some correction, some restoration of balance. The question is, what did each witness believe this correction would entail? I confess I do not follow your reasoning. Consider the nature of expectation, my dear fellow. Each person interprets another's words through the lens of their own assumptions and desires. Mrs. Berridge, a faithful servant, assumes her master speaks of providing for his relations. The gardener, with no personal stake in the matter, uses neutral language about justice. But Edward Markham speaks of fairness, suggesting he believed the correction would benefit him personally. And you believe these expectations are significant? I believe they may be crucial. Tomorrow we shall return to Norwood and conduct a more thorough examination of what each member of the household expected to occur. And human nature is such that we often hear what we wish to hear and remember what we expect to remember. The truth may lie not in what was said, but in how it was understood. The following morning saw us once more upon the Norwood train. The weather had turned colder still, and frost glittered upon the bare branches of the trees we passed. Holmes sat in silence, smoking his pipe and gazing out at the winter landscape with that distant expression which indicated his mind was far from the scene before his eyes. Upon our arrival at Norwood Vale, we found Inspector Lestrade awaiting us, his expression a mixture of impatience and suspicion. "Mr. Holmes," he said, without preamble, "I understand you have been conducting inquiries of your own. I trust you will share any discoveries which bear upon the case?" "I shall share everything when I am certain of my facts, Inspector. At present I am merely gathering information. I wish to interview the household staff once more, if you have no objection." "Interview them as you like, though I cannot see what more they can tell us. The evidence speaks plainly enough." We began with the gardener, Hodges, a weathered man of perhaps 60 years who received us in the conservatory, where he was tending to the winter plants. Holmes's questions seemed at first to meander aimlessly. touching upon Sir Lionel's habits, his relations with his nephew, his general demeanour in the weeks before his death. You mentioned to Inspector Lestrade that Sir Lionel spoke of correcting an injustice, Holmes said at length. Can you recall the context of this remark? Hodges scratched his chin thoughtfully. It was perhaps 10 days before his death, sir. I was working in the garden below the study window, and Sir Lionel came out to take the air. He seemed troubled in his mind, if I may say so. He remarked upon the weather, as gentlemen will, and then he said, quite sudden-like, that a man who has lived long learns he must sometimes undo the mistakes of his younger days. Those were his exact words. Near enough, sir. Then he said something about setting old wrongs to right, that justice delayed was still justice worth pursuing. Did he mention anyone by name? Not that I recall, sir, but I had the impression he was thinking of family matters. He had received a letter that morning which seemed to agitate him considerably. A letter? Did you observe anything about it? Only that it bore a London postmark and was written in a lady's hand. Mrs. Berridge took it up to him with the Morning Post. Holmes made a note of this. Thank you, Hodges. You've been most helpful. We next sought out the housemaid, Annie Price, who proved to be a girl of perhaps 20, with an intelligent face and a nervous manner. She confirmed her previous account of the quarrel she had overheard, but Holmes pressed her for details. You are certain the voices were raised in anger? Oh yes, sir, quite certain. I was passing through the hall on my way to lay the fires in the upper rooms, and I could hear them quite plainly through the study door. Could you make out any words? She hesitated. Not distinctly, sir, but I heard Mr. Edward say something about it being unfair, and Sir Lionel responded in a sharp tone. Then there was a period of quiet speech which I could not hear, and then Mr. Edward's voice again saying he had expected better. Expected better, Holmes repeated softly. Those were his words? Yes, sir, I'm quite sure of it. And Sir Lionel's response? I could not make it out clearly, sir, but the tone seemed sad, rather than angry. If I may say so, it sounded as though Sir Lionel were disappointed, not furious. Holmes questioned her further about the timing and duration of the quarrel, then thanked her and dismissed her. I observed that his expression had grown increasingly thoughtful. Mrs. Berridge received us in her sitting-room, a comfortable apartment filled with the accumulated treasures of long service. She offered us tea, which Holmes declined with his customary impatience for such niceties. Mrs. Berridge, he began, I should like you to cast your mind back to the letter which arrived for Sir Lionel some 10 days before his death, the one with the London postmark. The housekeeper's face showed surprise. I remember it, sir. How did you— But of course, Hodges must have mentioned it. Yes, a letter came that morning. Sir Lionel read it at breakfast and became quite absorbed. He took it with him to the study and spent the entire morning in there, barely touching his luncheon when I brought it to him. Did he mention the letter's contents? Not directly, sir, but that evening, when I brought his port, he was working at his desk with various papers spread before him. He looked up as I entered and said, Mrs. Berridge, I've been unjust to someone who deserved better of me. I mean to rectify the matter. I asked if there was anything I could do to assist him, and he smiled and said, Only patience, Mrs. Berridge. Some wrongs take time to right, but I shall see it done before I'm too old to care. Did you form any impression of whom he meant? She considered carefully. I assumed he spoke of Mr. Edward, sir. The young man had been here frequently in recent months, and Sir Lionel seemed concerned about his circumstances. I thought perhaps he meant to settle some debt, or advance him some money against his inheritance. A natural assumption, Holmes murmured. Tell me, did Sir Lionel ever mention any other relations who might have a claim upon his estate? Well, there was Miss Clara Harbury, sir, Mr. Stephen Harbury's daughter. Sir Lionel had been close to her father in their youth, before some quarrel separated them. I understand Mr. Harbury fell upon difficult times after the disagreement, and his wife died young. Sir Lionel sometimes spoke of the matter with regret. Did Miss Harbury ever visit Norwood Vale? Not to my knowledge, sir, but Sir Lionel did mention her name once or twice in recent weeks. He said it was a shame that innocents should suffer for the pride of their elders. Holmes rose and moved to the window, looking out over the frost-covered gardens. "One final question, Mrs. Berridge. When Sir Lionel spoke of setting matters right, did you ever consider that he might mean to reduce Edward Markham's inheritance rather than increase it?" The housekeeper's eyes widened. "Reduce it, sir? Why, no. It never occurred to me." "Why would he do such a thing?" "Why, indeed?" said Holmes quietly. "Thank you, Mrs. Berridge. You've been invaluable." As we departed the house, I ventured to ask what conclusions he had drawn from these interviews. "Each witness heard what they expected to hear, Watson. Mrs. Berridge assumed Sir Lionel meant to benefit Edward, because she knew of the young man's difficulties. Edward himself assumed he would benefit because he needed to believe so. Even the gardener, with no personal interest, interpreted Sir Lionel's words through the lens of conventional expectation. That a wealthy man speaks of justice, he naturally means to provide for his family. But you believe otherwise." "I believe Sir Lionel may have meant precisely what he said, that he intended to correct an injustice. But the nature of that injustice may not be what anyone assumed. Consider, Watson. If Sir Lionel felt he had wronged his old friend Harbury, and if that wrong had consequences for Harbury's daughter, might not the correction involve providing for her rather than for Edward? Good heavens, you mean the alterations to the will may have reduced Edward's inheritance and increased that of Miss Clara Harbury. It would explain everything. Sir Lionel's careful preparation, his working late into the night, his remarks about setting old wrongs to right. And if Stephen Harbury discovered what his old friend intended—" Holmes broke off abruptly, and I saw his jaw tighten. "If Harbury discovered it," I finished slowly, "then he would have every motive to prevent those changes from being honoured. But to murder his old friend and frame an innocent man—" "Is a crime of singular wickedness," Holmes agreed. "But we have not yet proof, only theory. We must tread carefully, Watson. Mr. Stephen Harbury is a solicitor of good standing and the executor of the estate. Any accusation against him must be supported by evidence beyond dispute. Come, we have work to do before this case can be brought to its conclusion." The train back to London seemed to crawl through the winter afternoon, and my thoughts were dark with the implications of what Holmes had suggested. If his theory proved correct, we were dealing with a criminal of uncommon cunning, one who had orchestrated an entire edifice of false evidence to conceal his own guilt. The question was whether we could prove it before Edward Markham paid the price for another man's crime. Chapter 6. Motives. Too convenient. Upon our return to Baker Street that evening, Holmes retreated immediately to his chemical corner, where he remained absorbed in various tests and experiments whose purpose he did not explain. I occupied myself with correspondence and the evening papers, though my attention wandered frequently to the figure bent over his test tubes and reagents. It was nearly 10 o'clock when he finally straightened, wiped his hands upon a towel, and joined me by the fire. "The ink analysis is complete," he announced without preamble. "The alterations to Sir Lionel's will were made no less than 3 weeks before his death, possibly longer. The chemical composition of the ink and its degree of oxidation place it well beyond the time frame during which Edward Markham was present at Norwood Vale. Then he could not possibly have made the alterations himself." "Precisely. Yet Lestrade and the entire machinery of official investigation have fixed upon him as the guilty party. Why, Watson? What makes a theory so compelling that contradictory evidence is overlooked or explained away?" I considered the question carefully. The evidence against him appears overwhelming. The fingerprints, the penknife, the fragments in his grate, all of which can be explained by innocent circumstances or deliberate arrangement. But I ask you to consider something more fundamental. Edward Markham's supposed motive. He is in debt. Therefore he altered his uncle's will to secure his inheritance. The logic appears sound, does it not? Entirely sound. Holmes shook his head slowly. Yet it contains a fatal flaw. Edward Markham was Sir Lionel's sole living nephew and his nearest male relation. Under the laws of intestacy, should Sir Lionel have died without a valid will, Edward would have inherited a substantial portion of the estate regardless. Why then would he risk forgery and murder to secure what he would eventually receive in any case? The observation struck me with considerable force. I had not considered that. Few do. The obvious motive blinds us to the unnecessary risk. But let us examine the matter more closely. He rose and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. According to the original will, Edward stood to inherit £5,000, a comfortable but not extravagant sum. The altered version leaves him nearly the entire estate, some £50,000 or more, a significant difference to be sure. Which strengthens his motive. Does it? Consider his actual circumstances. Edward is 28 years old, in reasonable health, with the prospect of a secure inheritance awaiting him whenever his uncle should die of natural causes. Sir Lionel was 68, and in poor health. The young man need only wait, Watson, and the fortune would be his without any crime whatsoever. Unless his debts were so pressing that he could not wait. Ah, but what were these debts? I made inquiries yesterday. Edward owes some £1,200 to various creditors, primarily gambling debts and tailor's bills. Substantial certainly for a young man of limited means, but hardly desperate. His creditors were content to wait, knowing of his expectations. There was no immediate pressure which would drive him to murder. I confess I found this reasoning persuasive, yet I could not entirely dismiss the evidence. What of the quarrel, then? The housemaid heard them arguing about money. She heard Edward say something was unfair and that he had expected better. But consider, Watson, if Edward had recently forged his uncle's will to increase his own inheritance, why would he then quarrel with Sir Lionel about money? The logical sequence makes no sense. A man who has secretly altered a will does not then complain to the victim about his financial circumstances, unless he sought to maintain the pretense of ignorance about the will's contents. Too subtle, Watson, and too risky. No, the quarrel suggests something quite different. Edward expected some provision from his uncle, was disappointed to learn the reality, and protested. The tone of sadness which Annie Price detected in Sir Lionel's voice supports this interpretation. He was disappointed in his nephew's attitude, perhaps, but not engaged in a violent confrontation with a would-be murderer. Holmes paused at the mantelpiece and struck a match to relight his pipe, which had gone out during his discourse. There is another consideration which troubles me deeply, the poison itself. Arsenic administered in port wine. Exactly so. Sir Lionel drank port every evening as a medicinal measure recommended by his physician. The decanter stood in his study, always available, always accessible. Now, Edward Markham does not drink port. Several witnesses confirm this detail, though its significance seems to have escaped Lestrade's notice. I fail to see why it matters. Because, my dear fellow, a man choosing poison as his weapon typically selects a method which allows him to avoid suspicion. If Edward wished to poison his uncle, why choose a beverage he himself never touches? The moment the poisoned port was discovered, any investigator would naturally ask who had access to it, and who would not be at risk of accidentally consuming it themselves. Edward's abstinence from port makes him more rather than less suspicious. You suggest a more cunning criminal would have poisoned something Edward himself might drink, or would have ensured that the method of administration pointed away from himself rather than toward him. The choice of port is either remarkably foolish or remarkably clever. Foolish if Edward is indeed guilty, clever if someone wished to implicate him. I felt the foundations of my certainty beginning to shift. Then you believe Edward Markham entirely innocent? I believe his supposed motive is both obvious and unnecessary. I believe the evidence against him is too perfectly arranged, and I believe we must ask ourselves who benefits from his conviction. Stephen Harbury, you mean? Consider his position, Watson. He is executor of the estate and father to Miss Clara Harbury, whom Sir Lionel apparently wished to benefit. If Sir Lionel's alterations to the will favoured Clara at Edward's expense, then Harbury had every reason to suppress those alterations. But he could not simply destroy the altered will. That would raise immediate suspicion. Instead, He needed the altered will to be discovered but attributed to Edward as a forgery. A devilishly clever scheme. If my theory is correct, yes. Harbury murders Sir Lionel, ensures the altered will is found, and then carefully constructs a web of evidence pointing to Edward. The fingerprints on the safe could easily have been arranged. Edward admits to having touched it on previous visits. The penknife with sealing wax could have been prepared in advance. The fragments in the grate could have been planted. Even the purchase of paper from the stationer could have been accomplished in Edward's name. But the arsenic, the chemist who sold it, claimed to have sold it to Edward Markham. But did he truly recognise the purchaser? Or did he simply accept the name given to him? We must verify this point. Tomorrow I shall visit the chemist myself and conduct a small experiment. Holmes fell silent, smoking thoughtfully while I attempted to absorb the implications of his theory. If he was correct, then an innocent man stood in danger of the gallows while the true murderer moved freely, protected by his position as the executor and by the very perfection of his scheme. There is one aspect which still puzzles me, I ventured after some minutes had passed. If Harbury wished to prevent Sir Lionel's alterations from being honoured, why not simply claim the will was forged without murdering his old friend? Surely a competent solicitor could have challenged its validity. An excellent question, Watson, and one which points to the heart of the matter. A legal challenge would have required time and would have attracted attention to the will's contents. The alterations themselves would have been examined, analysed, and discussed in open court. Sir Lionel's intentions would have become public knowledge. But if Sir Lionel dies and his nephew is convicted of forgery and murder, the altered will is dismissed as criminal work, and its actual provisions, the restoration of fortune to Clara Harbury, are never honoured. The original will stands, leaving Clara with nothing. Good God, to murder for one's daughter is perhaps the oldest motive in human history. Parental love, twisted into something monstrous by greed or desperation. But we have not yet sufficient proof to make such an accusation. Tomorrow we must gather more evidence. I need to examine the chemist's records, as verify certain timelines, and if possible, speak with Miss Clara Harbury herself. Will Lestrade cooperate? Holmes smiled grimly. Lestrade is convinced of Edward's guilt, and will see no reason to pursue alternative theories. No, Watson, we must conduct this investigation independently. The risk is considerable. If I am wrong, I shall appear a fool. But if I am right, an innocent man's life hangs in the balance, and that is a risk I am prepared to take. The following morning brought a development which seemed to complicate matters further. A telegram arrived from Lestrade informing us that Edward Markham had attempted to flee during the night, had been apprehended at the railway station, and was now formally under arrest. The news spread rapidly through London, and by afternoon the evening papers were proclaiming Edward's guilt with confident headlines. Holmes read these reports with a dark expression. "The trap closes," he murmured. "Public opinion hardens against the accused, and the true criminal grows bolder in his security. We have little time, Watson. If Edward is brought to trial with the evidence as it now stands, no jury will acquit him. What will you do?" "What I must. I shall prove Harbury's guilt through the only means available to me, by demonstrating that his actions contradict his stated knowledge, and that his knowledge could only have come from guilt. It will require careful preparation and a certain amount of theatrical staging, but I believe it can be done. For now, though, we have an appointment with a chemist in Norwood." As we prepared to depart, where I reflected upon the strange nature of this case, we had begun with what appeared to be overwhelming evidence of guilt, only to discover layers of complexity and contradiction beneath the surface. The truth, as Holmes had observed, was not always comfortable, but it was always worth pursuing. Whether we could reach it in time to save Edward Markham remained to be seen. The afternoon train to Norwood carried us through a landscape still locked in winter's grip, and I could not shake the feeling that we were racing against time itself in our pursuit of justice. Chapter 7. The Second Discovery. The chemist's shop in Norwood High Street proved to be a modest establishment. its window displaying the traditional coloured bottles and advertisements for patent medicines. Mr. Josiah Pemberton, the proprietor, was a precise man of middle years who received us with the nervous deference of one who had already been questioned by the police and found the experience unsettling. "Mr. Holmes," he said, wringing his hand slightly, "I have already told Inspector Lestrade everything I know about the matter. I sold arsenic to Mr. Edward Markham on the 28th of January. I recorded the sale in my poison register, as required by law, and obtained his signature." "I should very much like to see that register," Holmes said mildly. Pemberton produced a large ledger from beneath his counter and opened it to the relevant page. There, in careful script, was recorded the sale of 2 ounces of arsenic to Edward Markham, with a signature that appeared to match the name. Holmes examined the entry with his lens, then looked up at the chemist. "Tell me, Mr. Pemberton, do you recall the gentleman who made this purchase?" The chemist hesitated. "Well, sir, it was some weeks ago, and we do have many customers." "Naturally. But the sale of arsenic is not a daily occurrence. Surely you would remember something of the purchaser's appearance." "He was a young gentleman, well dressed. Fair-haired, I believe. He said he needed the arsenic for treating a wasp nest at his residence." "A common enough purpose. Did you know him by sight?" "No, sir. He gave his name when I asked, and I had no reason to doubt it." Holmes closed the ledger thoughtfully. "One final question, Mr. Pemberton. When the gentleman gave his name, did he spell it, or did you write it as he pronounced it?" The chemist frowned, clearly trying to recall. "He spelled it, sir. I remember because he was quite particular about it." "Markham," he said. Markham. "Thank you. You have been most helpful." As we departed the shop, I turned to Holmes with some puzzlement. "What significance does the spelling have?" "Considerable significance, Watson. A man giving his own name does not typically spell it unless asked to do so. The spelling suggests either that the purchaser was uncertain of the name's orthography, which Edward Markham, bearing the name since birth, would not be, or that he wished to ensure the name was recorded with perfect accuracy. Why would someone purchasing poison for a legitimate purpose be so concerned with the precise recording of their identity?" "You believe someone impersonated Edward?" "I believe it highly probable. The chemist did not know Edward by sight. The physical description was vague enough to fit many young gentlemen, and the careful spelling of the name suggests deliberate creation of a false record." We returned to Baker Street to find a message awaiting us from Lestrade. The inspector requested Holmes's presence at Scotland Yard on a matter of urgency. We found him in his office, his expression grave. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began without preamble, "I thought you should know that further evidence has come to light. A porter at Norwood Station has identified Edward Markham as having arrived on the early train on the day of Sir Lionel's death, 2 hours before the time Markham claimed. This directly contradicts his statement and places him at Norwood Vale, with ample opportunity to commit both the forgery and the murder." Holmes received this intelligence without visible reaction. "You have questioned this porter carefully?" "Most carefully." "He is quite certain of the identification. He remembers Mr. Markham particularly because the gentleman seemed agitated and asked twice about the time." "Interesting. May I speak with this porter myself?" "If you wish, though I cannot see what purpose it would serve. The man's testimony is clear and consistent." We travelled immediately to Norwood Station, where we found the porter, a grizzled man named Thomas Wickham, taking his midday meal in the waiting room. He confirmed Lestrade's account readily enough. "Oh, yes, sir, I remember the gentleman well. Fair-haired, well-dressed, carrying a small valise. He came off the 8:15 train and asked me the time most particular-like. Then he asked again not 5 minutes later as though he'd forgotten." "Can you describe the valise?" Holmes asked. Wickham considered. "Brown leather? Sir, of good quality. Had brass corners, if I recall correctly." "And you're certain this was on the 3rd of February?" "Quite certain, sir. It was the morning before we heard about Sir Lionel's death. The gentleman's manner stuck in my mind because he seemed so nervous-like." Holmes thanked him and we departed. As we walked back toward the High Street, I ventured to observe that the evidence seemed increasingly damning. Does it, Watson? Or does it seem carefully arranged to appear so? Consider. A nervous gentleman arrives early, asks repeatedly about the time, and carries a distinctive valise. Why would Edward Markham, if engaged in a criminal enterprise, draw such attention to himself? Would he not rather slip into town unnoticed? Perhaps his nerves overcame his caution. Perhaps. Yet I note that the porter's description of the valise matches nothing in the inventory of Edward's possessions taken when he was arrested. Where is this brown leather valise with brass corners? I confess I had no answer to this question. The afternoon brought news which sent shockwaves through London. A trace of arsenic had been discovered in Edward Markham's travelling case, the very case he had carried with him to Norwood Vale. Moreover, further investigation had revealed that Edward had indeed studied chemistry at university, giving him the knowledge necessary to handle poison safely. When we learned of these developments from the evening papers, Holmes's expression grew darker still. "The net tightens," he murmured. "Each new discovery appears to seal Edward's fate more completely. Yet observe, Watson, and how perfectly each piece of evidence serves to eliminate doubt. The arsenic in his travelling case, the chemistry education, the early arrival at the station, all facts which can be readily verified, and which admit of no easy explanation save guilt. You still doubt his guilt? I doubt the convenience of it, my dear fellow. When evidence accumulates with such mathematical precision, I suspect arrangement rather than accident. But my suspicions are not proof, and proof is what we desperately need." That evening, as we sat in our Baker Street lodgings, Holmes engaged in one of his periods of intense cogitation. He sat motionless in his chair for nearly 2 hours, his eyes closed, his fingers pressed together in that characteristic attitude which indicated the working of his remarkable mind. I had long since given up attempting to engage him in conversation during these periods, and contented myself with my newspaper. It was nearly 9 o'clock when he suddenly opened his eyes and sat forward with an exclamation. "Watson, I have been a fool. The answer has been before us all along, but I failed to see it because I was looking in the wrong direction." "What answer?" "The answer to how we can prove Harbury's guilt. He has made one error, one small slip which betrays his entire scheme. But to demonstrate it, I shall need to examine the original will once more, and I shall need to gather all the principals in this case together. Lestrade will never agree to such a meeting while he is convinced of Edward's guilt. Then I shall have to convince him otherwise. Tomorrow I shall present him with certain facts which he has overlooked, facts which, when properly understood, reveal not Edward's guilt but Harbury's. Can you share these facts with me?" Holmes smiled, but there was no humour in it. "In due course, my dear Watson. For now I must verify certain suspicions, but I can tell you this. Stephen Harbury claimed never to have seen the altered will before Sir Lionel's death. Yet he described the missing clauses to us in precise terms when we first met with him. How could he know what had been removed unless he'd seen the original document, or unless he himself had removed those sections? The observation struck me with the force of revelation. Good heavens, you're quite right. But might he not have deduced the contents from what remained? That is precisely what he would claim if challenged, which is why I need more than this single contradiction. I need to demonstrate beyond all doubt that Harbury not only knew the contents of the altered will, but acted upon that knowledge in ways which prove his guilt. Tomorrow, Watson, we shall begin to dismantle the structure of lies which has condemned an innocent man." The night passed slowly, and I slept poorly. My dreams troubled by images of Edward Markham mounting the scaffold, while the true criminal watched from the crowd. When I rose the following morning, I found Holmes already at work, surrounded by papers and reference books, his face drawn but animated with that fierce energy which indicated he was closing in upon his quarry. "Ah, Watson," he greeted me. "I trust you are prepared for a busy day. We have much to accomplish if we are to save Edward Markham from the gallows. First, we must call upon Lestrade. Then we must arrange a meeting at Norwood Vale with all the principals in this case. And finally, We must lay a trap for a murderer. A trap of the most satisfactory kind, one which uses the criminal's own cleverness against him. But come, we must not delay. Time is our enemy now, and we must use every hour wisely. As I prepared for the day ahead, I reflected upon the strange twists this case had taken. What had begun as an apparently simple matter of forgery and murder had revealed itself to be a web of deception more intricate than any I had previously encountered. Yet Holmes had perceived the truth beneath the lies, and now, at last, we moved toward its final exposure. Whether we could prove that truth in time to save Edward Markham remained to be seen, but I knew that my friend would employ every faculty at his command in the service of justice. The game, as Holmes would say, was most decidedly afoot. Chapter 8. Confidence in Error. The meeting with Inspector Lestrade took place in his cramped office at Scotland Yard on a grey February morning. The inspector sat behind his desk with the air of a man who has completed a difficult task successfully, and now awaits only the formal recognition of his achievement. Before him lay a folder thick with documents, each representing another link in the chain of evidence against Edward Markham. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he began, gesturing to the chairs opposite his desk. "I appreciate your continued interest in this case. But I must tell you frankly that the matter is now beyond any reasonable doubt. Edward Markham will be formally charged with murder and forgery within the week. The Crown Prosecutor has reviewed the evidence and finds it conclusive." Holmes settled into his chair with that deceptive casualness which I had learned often preceded his most devastating observations. "Conclusive, you say? Then you will not object to reviewing that evidence with me, point by point, to ensure that no detail has been overlooked?" Lestrade's expression suggested he considered this a waste of time, but professional courtesy compelled him to agree. "Very well, Mr. Holmes. What aspects concern you?" "Let us begin with the supposed crime itself. According to your theory, Edward Markham arrived at Norwood Vale, entered his uncle's study, opened the safe, removed the will, altered it with forged additions, replaced it in the safe, and subsequently poisoned his uncle. Is that correct?" "That is the sequence of events, yes." "And when precisely did these events occur?" "On the evening of the 3rd of February, when Markham visited his uncle. Yet the chemical analysis I obtained from Messrs. Carruthers and Webb indicates that the alterations to the will were made no less than 3 weeks before that date. How do you explain this discrepancy?" Lestrade frowned. "Chemical analysis of ink is hardly an exact science, Mr. Holmes. There is considerable margin for error in such determinations." "Granted, but there are other inconsistencies. You have established that Edward arrived on the early train, giving him ample time to commit the forgery. Yet the porter describes him as carrying a brown leather valise with brass corners. Edward's possessions, inventoried upon his arrest, include no such item. Where is this valise?" "Perhaps he disposed of it, or it was misidentified by the porter." "Perhaps. And the arsenic found in his travelling case, was any found in the study itself or in any location where it might have been prepared for administration?" "No, but that merely indicates careful clean-up." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Let us consider the timeline more carefully, Inspector. You believe Edward arrived early, forged the will, and then waited hours before poisoning his uncle's port wine. Why wait? If he had already committed the forgery, why not complete the crime immediately and depart? Presumably to avoid suspicion. He quarrelled with his uncle in the evening to establish a plausible reason for his visit. Ah, yes, the quarrel. The housemaid reports hearing Edward say that something was unfair and that he'd expected better. But if Edward had just altered the will to make himself the primary beneficiary, why would he complain? The logic escapes me. Lestrade's confidence began to show signs of strain. The quarrel may have been about other matters. We cannot know every detail of their conversation. True. Yet we're asked to believe that Edward, having committed forgery, then engaged in a loud argument which drew the attention of the servants and created witnesses to his presence. This seems remarkably careless for a calculating murderer. Criminals often act irrationally when under pressure. Do they? Holmes drew from his pocket a small notebook. "Let me share with you the results of certain experiments I conducted yesterday. I measured the precise dimensions of the alterations to Sir Lionel's will. Each cut strip is exactly 7/8 of an inch wide. I then measured the time required to make such cuts with careful precision. It requires a minimum of 45 minutes of concentrated work to remove the sections, prepare the replacement slips, write the new text, and seal them in place with wax." So, this proves only that Markham took his time to do the work properly. But where did he perform this work, Inspector? You claim he did it in Sir Lionel's study. Yet during those 45 minutes, he would have needed excellent light, a steady surface, the proper tools, and complete freedom from interruption. The servants were about the house. Sir Lionel himself might have entered at any moment. The risk of discovery would have been enormous. He might have done the work elsewhere and brought the completed forgery with him, in which case the fragments found in his bedroom grate are meaningless, as they would represent preparation done at his own lodgings, not criminal activity at Norwood Vale. But if he prepared the forgery at home, why leave incriminating evidence in his own fireplace? Why not destroy it completely? Lestrade was becoming visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Holmes, criminals make mistakes. That is how we catch them." "Indeed they do, but in this case, we have a criminal who's simultaneously brilliantly careful, executing perfect forgery, leaving no traces of arsenic preparation, cleaning up all evidence, and remarkably careless, leaving fragments in his grate, placing poison in his own travelling case, drawing attention to himself at the railway station. The contradiction is striking, is it not?" "What are you suggesting?" Holmes rose and began to pace in the confined space of the office. "I am suggesting, Inspector, that the theory succeeds admirably, provided one refrains from examining its foundation. Each piece of evidence taken individually appears damning, but when we consider them collectively and test them against the practical requirements of the supposed crime, they collapse into contradiction. Then who did commit the murder? Or if not Edward Markham? I shall demonstrate that presently, but first I must ask you to arrange a meeting at Norwood Vale tomorrow afternoon. I should like to gather all the principals in this case. Yourself, Mr. Stephen Harbury, Edward Markham, if he can be released temporarily into custody, and any household staff who may be relevant. For what purpose? To demonstrate the truth, Inspector, to show how the crime was actually committed and by whom." Lestrade regarded Holmes with deep scepticism. "You're asking me to bring together the accused, the executor, and various witnesses on the basis of some theory you have not yet explained. That is highly irregular, Mr. Holmes. I am asking you to permit me to prove an innocent man's innocence before he is destroyed by false evidence. Surely that is worth a few hours of your time." After a long pause, Lestrade nodded slowly. "Very well, I shall arrange it. But I warn you, Mr. Holmes, if this proves to be some wild speculation on your part, it will reflect poorly upon both of us. If I am wrong, Inspector, I shall accept whatever professional consequences follow. But I am not wrong. Of that I am quite certain." As we departed Scotland Yard and made our way through the cold London streets, I questioned Holmes about his certainty. "You seem very confident in your theory, yet you have not explained to me precisely how you intend to prove Harbury's guilt." "Because the proof relies upon a demonstration which must be made before witnesses, Watson. I must show not merely that Harbury could have committed the crime, but that he did commit it, and that his guilt is betrayed by his own words and actions. The contradiction you mentioned earlier, about his describing the missing clauses? That is part of it, yes, but there is more. Harbury made several statements during our initial meeting which reveal knowledge he could not possess unless he himself altered the will, or rather, unless he himself knew that Sir Lionel had altered it in a manner which disinherited his daughter. But how will you prove what he knew and when he knew it? By forcing him to explain what he cannot explain, by presenting him with facts which admit of only one interpretation, and by doing so before witnesses who cannot be dismissed or ignored. We spent the remainder of the day in preparation. Holmes sent several telegrams, consulted various reference works, and made cryptic notes in his commonplace book. He also dispatched a messenger to Edward Markham's solicitor with a letter whose contents he did not share with me. That evening, as we sat before the fire in Baker Street, Holmes finally broke his silence on the subject. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall see whether justice can be extracted from the jaws of error. I have set the stage as carefully as I can. The rest depends upon Harbury's reaction when confronted with irrefutable logic. And if he simply denies everything, then I must rely upon the force of demonstration and the weight of contradiction. A guilty man may lie, but he cannot escape the trap created by his own previous statements. Harbury has been too clever, too careful in constructing his false case against Edward. That very cleverness will be his undoing. I confess I do not entirely follow your reasoning." Holmes smiled, but his eyes remained serious. "You shall, my dear fellow. Tomorrow, when all the pieces are laid out before us, the pattern will become clear. For now, I suggest you get some rest. The confrontation ahead will require all our faculties, and I shall need you as witness to what transpires." I retired that night with a mind full of questions and uncertainties. Holmes's confidence was absolute, yet I could not quite grasp the nature of the proof he intended to present. How could words spoken weeks ago condemn a man who had seemingly constructed a perfect case against another? How could contradictions in testimony outweigh physical evidence of fingerprints, poison, and forged documents? Yet I had learned, over our long association, to trust Holmes's judgment even when I could not fully comprehend his reasoning. If he believed he could prove Edward Markham's innocence and Stephen Harbury's guilt, then I would stand beside him and await the revelation of truth. The case of the redacted will was approaching its climax, and I sensed that the resolution would be as surprising as the crime itself had been cunning. Chapter 9. The Broken Assumption. The afternoon of the following day found us once more at Norwood Vale. The study where Sir Lionel had met his death had been arranged as a kind of impromptu courtroom, with chairs placed in a semicircle facing the desk. Inspector Lestrade had carried out Holmes's instructions with evident reluctance, and as the various parties assembled, and his expression suggested he expected nothing but embarrassment from the proceedings. Edward Markham arrived under police escort, his face pale but his bearing composed. He acknowledged Holmes with a look of desperate hope that was painful to witness. Stephen Harbury entered with the confident stride of a man who had nothing to fear, his features arranged in an expression of professional concern. Mrs. Berridge and the other servants stood near the door, uncertain of their role in these unusual proceedings. When all were seated, Holmes rose and stood before the fireplace, his tall figure commanding the room's attention. "Gentlemen," he began, "we are gathered here to examine a death and a supposed forgery. The official theory holds that Edward Markham altered his uncle's will and murdered him to secure an inheritance. The evidence supporting this theory appears overwhelming, yet I am here to demonstrate that this theory rests upon a single false assumption, and that when this assumption is corrected, the entire structure of the case collapses and reveals the true criminal." "Really, Mr. Holmes," Harbury interjected, his tone suggesting tolerant patience with a foolish display, "I fail to see what new light you can shed on matters which seem quite clear." "Then I shall endeavour to illuminate them. The central assumption upon which this case rests is that the will was altered by Edward Markham after his arrival at Norwood Vale. Every piece of evidence, every theory, every accusation flows from this single premise, but that premise is false." Lestrade stirred in his chair. "We have established beyond doubt that the will was altered, Mr. Holmes. The physical evidence is indisputable. The alteration is indisputable, Inspector, but the identity of who performed that alteration is very much in dispute. I have here Sir Lionel's personal notebook, found in his desk." Holmes held up the leather-bound volume. Within these pages are detailed measurements, calculations, and notes regarding modifications to his will. The dates recorded here indicate he began this work nearly a month before his death. He opened the notebook and read aloud. "January the 8th. Must correct the injustice to Clara. 7/8" strips will preserve the document's integrity. Must match the original ink precisely. He looked up. These are Sir Lionel's own words, in Sir Lionel's own hand. He altered his own will. A murmur ran through the assembled group, and Edward Markham's face showed dawning comprehension mixed with relief. But it was Harbury's reaction which most interested me. For a moment a flash of something, fear, anger, calculation, crossed his features before he regained his composure. "That is preposterous," Harbury declared. "Why would Sir Lionel alter his own will in such an irregular manner? If he wished to change his testamentary dispositions, he had only to instruct his solicitors to draft a new document." "An excellent question, Mr. Harbury, and one which brings us to the heart of the matter. Sir Lionel altered his will because the changes he wished to make were of a personal nature, concerning a wrong he had committed years ago against your father." Harbury's face grew rigid. "My father has been dead for 15 years. What possible bearing? Your father and Sir Lionel were close friends in their youth, were they not? They worked together, planned business ventures together, but they quarrelled over some matter, and the friendship ended. Your father's fortunes declined afterward, while Sir Lionel's prospered. Sir Lionel came to believe he had wronged his old friend, that he had perhaps profited from information or opportunities which should have been shared. He wished to make amends by providing for your father's daughter, your sister, Miss Clara Harbury. This is speculation without foundation." "Is it? Mrs. Berridge, you heard Sir Lionel speak of correcting an old wrong. He mentioned Miss Clara by name, did he not?" The housekeeper nodded nervously. "He did, sir. He said it was a shame that innocents should suffer for the pride of their elders." Holmes turned back to Harbury. "Sir Lionel altered his will to restore a substantial portion of his estate to Miss Clara. The redacted clauses actually reduced Edward Markham's inheritance and increased hers. This is the truth which has been obscured by the assumption of forgery." "Even if true," Lestrade interjected, "this does not prove who murdered Sir Lionel." "Does it not? Consider the motive, Inspector. If Sir Lionel's alterations favoured Miss Clara Harbury, who stood to lose by those alterations? Not Edward, who would inherit a comfortable sum regardless. Not Miss Clara, who gained by them. But Stephen Harbury, executor of the estate and father to the beneficiary, he stood to lose everything if those alterations were honoured." "How dare you suggest?" Harbury began, rising from his chair. "I suggest nothing without proof, sir. I state facts which admit of only one interpretation. You claimed when we first met never to have seen the altered will before Sir Lionel's death. Yet you described to us the missing clauses in precise terms. How could you know what had been removed unless you had seen the original document?" "I deduced it from what remained, as any competent solicitor would." "Did you? Then explain this." Holmes drew from his pocket a sheet of paper. "This is a transcript of your initial statement to Inspector Lestrade. You described the redacted passages as containing specific bequests to charitable institutions. You named those institutions the Royal Hospital, the Society for the Relief of Distressed Gentlefolk, and St. Bartholomew's Orphanage. These are indeed the institutions mentioned in the original will. But how could you know they were the subjects of the removed passages unless you had read that original will in its complete form?" For the first time, Harbury's confidence visibly wavered. "I had a copy of the original will from Sir Lionel's solicitors. It was my duty as executor to know its contents." "Precisely so. You knew the original provisions. When Sir Lionel died and you opened his safe, you found the altered will with its redacted sections. An honest executor would have sought to determine Sir Lionel's intentions and honour them. But you did not do so. Instead, you conceived a scheme to suppress those alterations by attributing them to Edward Markham as forgery. This is absurd. Why would I do such a thing? Because you discovered that the alterations disinherited your daughter. The passages removed from the original will were those leaving money to charities. The new passages redirected that money to Miss Clara. But you could not allow that. You could not permit your daughter to inherit wealth obtained through your father's old friend's guilt and charity. Pride, Mr. Harbury, the same pride which had separated your father and Sir Lionel drove you to murder. You have no proof of this, do I not? Let us examine the evidence which was used to condemn Edward Markham. The arsenic purchased in his name. The chemist confirmed the buyer spelled the name carefully, and as one would do when creating a false record. The fingerprints on the safe, easily obtained from any of Edward's previous visits. The penknife with sealing wax could have been prepared and planted. The fragments in the grate, placed there deliberately. The testimony of the railway porter, describing a man carrying a distinctive valise which has never been found because it never existed. Holmes's voice grew harder. You orchestrated every element of this false case, Mr. Harbury. You murdered your old friend with poison, then carefully arranged evidence to implicate Edward. You knew the young man was in financial difficulties. You knew he had quarrelled with his uncle. You knew he would make a perfect scapegoat. Prove it, Harbury snapped, though his face had gone pale. Very well, I shall prove it by your own words. You claimed never to have seen the altered will before Sir Lionel's death, yet you knew precisely which clauses had been removed and what institutions they had benefited. You could only know this if you had compared the original will with the altered version, which means you lied about not having seen the alterations. Why lie unless you had something to conceal? Holmes moved to the desk and picked up the will itself. Furthermore, you told us that the alterations strongly favoured Edward Markham, that he would inherit nearly the entire estate. But how could you know what the new clauses contained? The slips are sealed in place with wax. To know their contents, one must break the seals and read them. Yet when we examined the will in your presence, the seals were intact. How did you know what the altered clauses said unless you had read them before sealing them yourself? Or unless you had broken those seals, read the contents, and then resealed them? The room had fallen absolutely silent. Every eye was fixed upon Harbury, whose confident demeanour had crumbled into desperation. There is more, Holmes continued relentlessly. The ink analysis proves the alterations were made weeks before Edward's final visit. The measurements in Sir Lionel's notebook match the cuts exactly. The tools used for the work were found in Sir Lionel's desk, arranged with a precision entirely unlike Edward's known habits. Every objective fact points to Sir Lionel having altered his own will, and to you, Mr. Harbury, all having murdered him to prevent those alterations from being honoured. I did it for Clara! The words burst from Harbury with the force of long-suppressed emotion. I did it for my daughter! Sir Lionel had no right to salve his conscience at my father's expense. My father was ruined by him. My mother died in poverty, and now he thought he could buy forgiveness by leaving money to Clara, as though she were some beggar to be pitied. The confession hung in the air, stunning in its sudden revelation. Lestrade rose slowly to his feet, his expression a mixture of shock and professional satisfaction. Stephen Harbury, he said formally, I arrest you for the murder of Sir Lionel Markham. As the constables moved forward to take Harbury into custody, I observed Edward Markham, who sat with his face buried in his hands, whether from relief or grief I could not say. The servants clustered near the door, whispering among themselves in horrified amazement. Holmes stood by the fireplace, his face grave, showing none of the triumph one might expect from such a brilliant demonstration. He had saved an innocent man from the gallows and brought a murderer to justice, yet there was no satisfaction in his expression, only a deep weariness. As we prepared to depart Norwood Vale, I reflected upon the case and its resolution. The truth had been hidden not by the absence of evidence, but by the abundance of false evidence, carefully arranged to lead investigation away from the true criminal. Only Holmes's relentless logic and his refusal to accept the obvious had revealed the deception. The case of the redacted will was concluded, but its lessons would long remain with me. Chapter 10. The Peril of Certainty. The weeks following Stephen Harbury's arrest passed with the inexorable machinery of justice grinding toward its conclusion. The case attracted considerable attention in the press, though for reasons quite different from those which had initially fueled public interest. Where once the papers had trumpeted Edward Markham's guilt with confident headlines, they now devoted lengthy columns to the remarkable chain of deductions by which Sherlock Holmes had exposed the true criminal. Edward Markham was released immediately upon Harbury's confession, and subsequently exonerated of all suspicion. The young man called upon us at Baker Street some days after his liberation, his appearance much improved, though his eyes still carried the shadow of his ordeal. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, gripping our hands with evident emotion, "I can never adequately express my gratitude. Without your intervention, I should certainly have been convicted and—" He broke off, unable to complete the terrible thought. Holmes waved away his thanks with characteristic impatience. "You owe your freedom not to my efforts but to the truth itself, Mr. Markham. I merely had the persistence to look beneath the surface of apparent certainty. Still, I must ask, how did you first come to suspect my innocence? The evidence against me seemed so complete. That very completeness aroused my suspicion. In my experience, genuine evidence accumulates like sediment, layer upon layer, often contradictory, always requiring careful interpretation. But the evidence against you was too perfectly arranged, and each piece supporting the next in a manner more suggestive of human design than natural occurrence. When I observed this pattern, I began to ask not whether you were guilty, but who wished you to appear so. After Edward had departed, promising to rebuild his life with the inheritance now rightfully his under the original will, I turned to Holmes with a question that had troubled me since the case's conclusion. You mentioned during your demonstration that Sir Lionel's alterations actually restored a portion of the estate to Miss Clara Harbury. Yet her father murdered to prevent this. I confess the psychology of it escapes me. Most men would welcome such fortune for their children. Holmes had been standing by the window gazing out at the Baker Street traffic, and he turned now with a thoughtful expression. Pride, Watson, is perhaps the most destructive of human emotions. Stephen Harbury could not bear the thought of his daughter accepting what he viewed as charity born of guilt. In his mind, Sir Lionel's bequest was an admission of wrongdoing, a confirmation that Harbury's father had been victim to some professional betrayal. To accept such money would be to accept the role of injured party, to acknowledge that the Harbury family required the condescension of their social betters. Surely providing for one's child outweighs such considerations. In a rational mind, yes, but Harbury's mind was not rational on this subject. His father's ruin and his mother's death in poverty had created a wound that never healed. When he discovered Sir Lionel's intentions, old resentments consumed him. Better, he thought, that Clara should receive nothing than that she should receive it as compensation for past wrongs. And so he murdered his father's old friend and attempted to condemn an innocent man. The progression is not uncommon, I fear. A man who has convinced himself that he serves some higher principle, family honour, justice, the righting of ancient wrongs, can justify almost any action. Harbury persuaded himself that he was protecting his daughter from humiliation, when in truth he was protecting his own pride. The trial of Stephen Harbury took place in early April and lasted 3 days. I attended throughout, watching, as the Crown presented the evidence which Holmes had assembled. The defence attempted to argue that Harbury had acted in a moment of passion, discovering the altered will and killing Sir Lionel in a rage of wounded family pride. But the careful preparation of false evidence against Edward Markham undermined any claim of impulsive action. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty. I observed Harbury as the sentence was pronounced. His face remained composed, almost defiant, as though even in defeat he clung to the righteousness of his cause. It was a chilling reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who believe themselves justified. Holmes did not attend the trial, preferring to immerse himself in other matters. When I returned to Baker Street after the verdict and reported the outcome, he merely nodded as though the result had never been in doubt. Justice has been served then, he said. though I confess the case leaves me with little satisfaction. An old man is dead, murdered by one he considered a friend. A young man's reputation has been stained despite his exoneration, and a daughter must live with the knowledge that her father chose pride over her welfare and murdered to preserve that pride. What became of Miss Clara Harbury? I asked, for I had heard no mention of her during the trial. She has gone to live with relations in Scotland, I understand. The original will stands, as Sir Lionel's alterations cannot be honoured, given that they were the motive for his murder. She receives nothing, which is perhaps the final tragic irony of the case. Harbury's crime accomplished precisely what he intended, the suppression of Sir Lionel's bequest, but at the cost of everything else he valued. Over dinner that evening, as we sat in our familiar chairs with the firelight playing across the walls of our sitting room, I found myself reflecting on the broader lessons of the case. "Holmes," I ventured, "what strikes me most forcefully about this affair is how easily we might all have accepted Edward's guilt. The evidence seemed overwhelming, the logic impeccable. Even I, knowing your methods and having witnessed your successes, found myself half convinced at times. And therein lies the most important lesson, Watson. The most dangerous error is the conclusion which explains everything at once. When a theory accounts for all observed facts with perfect consistency, we must ask ourselves whether we are observing truth or clever arrangement. Nature is rarely so obliging as to present her evidence in neat logical sequence. Yet surely the scientific method requires us to form theories which account for the facts. Indeed it does. But it also requires us to test those theories rigorously, to seek not merely confirmatory evidence but contradictory evidence. The human mind has a powerful tendency towards certainty, Watson. Once we have formed a theory which seems to explain events, we unconsciously begin to arrange all subsequent observations to support that theory. We notice what confirms and overlook what contradicts. He paused to relight his pipe, which had gone out during his discourse. Lestrade is not a foolish man, yet he accepted Edward's guilt without serious question, because the evidence supported a plausible narrative. A young man in debt, a wealthy uncle. An altered will. The story wrote itself. But stories are not truth, they are merely arrangements of facts into familiar patterns. Truth requires us to look beyond pattern to process, to ask not merely what happened, but how it could have happened. You speak as though certainty itself were dangerous. Certainty is dangerous, my dear fellow, when it prevents us from examining our assumptions. In this case, everyone assumed that alteration of a will implied criminal forgery. But why should it? A man may alter his own will for entirely legitimate reasons. The assumption of criminality coloured every subsequent observation, and led directly to the false conviction of an innocent man. I considered this carefully. Then the lesson of the redacted will is that we must question our assumptions. More than that, Watson, we must recognise that our assumptions are often invisible to us. We see not the world as it is, but the world as we expect it to be. The successful investigator must learn to see past expectation to reality, to distinguish between the narrative we construct and the facts themselves. He fell silent, and we sat together in companionable quiet as the fire burned low and the sounds of London at evening drifted up from the street below. I found myself thinking of all the cases we had investigated together, and how often Holmes had penetrated to truth by questioning what others accepted without examination. Later, as I prepared these notes for publication, I realised that the case of the redacted will represented something more than another of Holmes's triumphs of deduction. It was a study in the psychology of certainty, a demonstration of how easily truth can be obscured by the very abundance of evidence arranged to support a false conclusion. Edward Markham had been saved not because Holmes discovered new facts, but because he questioned the interpretation of existing facts. He had looked at the same evidence available to Lestrade and the Crown Prosecutor, and asked the fundamental question which they had never thought to ask. What if our central assumption is wrong? That question, and the intellectual courage to pursue it despite the weight of apparent certainty, had made all the difference between justice and judicial murder. As I wrote the final words of this account, I reflected that future readers might learn from this case what I had learned, that suspicion may be swift, but deduction must be patient, that evidence can be arranged as well as discovered, and that the most important question an investigator can ask is not, what does this prove, but rather, what have I assumed? These lessons, hard won from the case of the redacted will, seem to me worthy of preservation. If this account serves to make even one reader more cautious in accepting the obvious, more sceptical of perfect explanations, then perhaps some good may come from the tragedy which befell Sir Lionel Markham and those whose lives were touched by his death. The case was closed, the criminal punished, and justice, however belatedly, served. Yet, as Holmes had observed, there was little satisfaction in the conclusion, only the sober recognition that truth, like justice, must sometimes be wrested from the grip of certainty itself.